Hey friends, can you hear the difference between these two audio sample examples? If you were able to hear the difference between those two examples, congrats, you've heard compression. I'll prove it. My work here is done. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time. Just kidding. Welcome to the 5 levels of understanding compression. Whether you're just starting out with music production or you're a seasoned pro, I'm sure everyone will learn a lot from this video. My goal is to significantly upgrade your understanding, and therefore your skill set, and ultimately your music when using compressors. Now, even though the intro featured Glue Compressor, which is a great compressor, and I have a video of it if you want to watch it up here, this video is focused on Ableton's standard compressor called Compressor, which is extremely clean and surgical, and above all else, has every standard feature that you'll find in any other downward compressor, whether it's a plugin or hardware. So it's a great compressor to learn from and to teach with. So even if for some reason you don't use Ableton Live, this video on compression applies to everyone. And similar to my Ableton online courses, this video is deep and thorough, so there are timestamps down below to help you navigate what I hope becomes a video that you come back to many, many times over as you develop your skills. Now, of course, there isn't a specific order in which compressors should be understood or utilized, but I structured this video so that each level builds upon the last one. And my hope is that this clarifies a bunch of concepts, and that after watching this, you feel a lot more confident when applying compression. So, with that out of the way, let's get it. So the entryway to understanding a compressor is that it is essentially an automatic volume control. When signals get too loud, it automatically turns them down. And depending upon the settings, if signals are too quiet, it turns them up. Let's take a look at a waveform before compression, and then take a look at it afterwards. We can clearly see that the uncompressed waveform has areas where the signal spikes up to these big peaks and then decays down to where it's nearly silent. However, when we look at that same passage of audio, but it's compressed, we can see that not only are those peaks significantly squashed down, but also that there are no areas where the signal is completely silent. What you're seeing here is exactly why we call them compressors. It appears as if we are physically compressing or squeezing the signal. So now that you have a visual understanding, let's watch and listen to put it all together. So here I've got both examples next to each other. The blue one is uncompressed and the green one is compressed. Let's go ahead and take a listen. So let's break down what we're actually hearing here. Let's focus on the snare. In the uncompressed example, the snare thwacks our ears and then decays away quickly. Bah, bah. But in the compressed example, that thwack is significantly softer, so the loudest aspect of the wave is reduced. Now, on the other hand, we can hear the snare drum decay rapidly on the uncompressed signal. But in the compressed signal, we can hear that the reverb or the room, which was quiet before, is now brought up in the signal. So a compressor, at its most basic level, is an automatic volume control. It can reduce the loudest part of a sound and bring up the quietest parts. But of course, that's only the tip of the iceberg here. Let's go ahead and dive deeper into level 2 of understanding compressors. So in this example, we have a synth line that is very dynamic. What do we mean by dynamic? Well, there are areas of notes where the signal gets very loud and other areas where the signal is quiet. So in order to control this signal, let's put a compressor on it. So do you hear a difference? That's a trick question. There's actually no difference at all when the compressor is on or off in this example. And this level of understanding compressors is going to explain why. In order to get the compressor to do anything to the signal, we first need to learn about what the threshold is. The threshold is how you tell the compressor when to reduce the signal. If the threshold is never reached, a compressor will literally do nothing to a signal. Let's go ahead and reduce the threshold until we can start to see and hear some changes to the signal. Maybe you're noticing this little yellow line that seems to follow the signal as it gets reduced. This is what's called gain reduction. Gain reduction is how you know that a compressor is actually having an effect on the signal. Or in other words, a compressor won't do anything if there's no gain reduction. Okay, so how do you make a compressor reduce gain? Well, signal needs to cross this threshold in order for any reduction of gain. So if, for example, the threshold is set all the way up here, none of the signal is going to cross it, and therefore there won't be any gain reduction. But as I pull it down, we can hear that the loudest parts of the signal are getting pushed down. Let's go ahead and place this synth line in a musical context or in a song. Take a listen. So we can hear that the loudest portions of this synth line are kind of jutting out or sticking out in this mix. They're kind of going ba, 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 and they're jarring and they're kind of surprising, right? So we can apply what we've learned thus far to take the loudest portions of that signal and push them down, okay, so that it can kind of sit better in the mix. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to turn on this compressor, and I'm going to pull the threshold down until we're controlling those peaks. So now we've controlled the signal, but I'm sure you've noticed something else. Before, when you listened to this synth line by itself, you could hear those quiet notes and the loud notes. You could hear it all, right? But because we're in a mix context, this is a classic mixing example where the quietest parts of this signal are getting lost, or they're getting masked by the other instruments. So, the third and final control to introduce in this second level of understanding compressors is, of course, the makeup gain. If all that you do with a compressor is pull a threshold down so that it starts to reduce signal, what are you doing? You're actually turning down the loudest parts of the signal. But the other portion from phase 1 of understanding compressors was that compressors can, with specific settings, also bring up the quietest parts. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add what's called makeup gain, or in Ableton's compressor's case, the output. We're going to turn the output up to compensate, okay, for how much we've turned down the loudest portions of the signal. So now we can hear the signal when it's quiet, and we can hear that we have pushed down the signal when it's loud. So in some ways, we're sort of setting safe boundaries, right? We're saying the signal, if it ever gets too loud, compress it. And then we're also saying, of course, the quietest parts of the signal, bring those up a little bit. So in other words, we're constraining the dynamic range of this signal, okay? This is why compressors are referred to as dynamics processors, okay? We are processing these dynamics, and in this case, we are reducing the dynamic range of this signal. So one of the biggest takeaways from this stage of understanding compressors is understanding that almost every compressor you'll ever see will have some form of gain reduction meter or display. Sometimes it's a needle, sometimes it's LEDs. This is how you know that a compressor is doing something. It's because a lot of compressor work can be subtle. Now, of course, what I'm doing here in this video is not subtle, right? I'm trying to hyper-emphasize these compression moves so that you can really hear the differences, okay? But all kinds of compressors in the world wouldn't have a gain reduction meter if it was so easy to hear differences in compression. So don't beat yourself up if only now you're starting to come around to understanding these kinds of things. Seeing gain reduction in a compressor is a great way to know that a compressor is actually doing something, okay? So threshold is very basic. You bring the threshold down until the portion of the signal that you'd like to control is passing the threshold. That easy. But what might not be so obvious is where you should set the makeup gain or the output of a compressor. And what I like to do, and something that you can do to help you make good mixing decisions, is to add makeup gain that resembles the average reduction that you see. So Ableton's compressor has 3 different views. We've been looking at the activity view is what it's called. There's also the transfer curve or the transfer function, and then there is the collapsed view. Now what's nice about the collapsed view is that you can actually see the numbers of the gain reduction. Let's go ahead and watch. It seems to me that the average of this compressor's gain reduction is somewhere around 4 decibels, right? Because it goes all the way up to above -8, and sometimes it hangs out at 0, right? So it's somewhere in the middle. That's why you'll notice that I've set the output gain to 4.5 decibels, okay? What I heard with my ears, and again, I was using my ears here, I wasn't actually looking at this, but something you can do when you're just getting started is to actually look at your gain reduction and try to find where the average is. And the whole goal with all of this is when you're using a compressor to try to make it so that when you turn the compressor on or when you turn the compressor off, that there is not a significantly huge big boost in gain or a huge reduction in gain. It sounds about the same loudness when it's on or when it's off. This will help you make better mixing decisions. So with the compressor off, let's listen to the mix. Now you can see here, just using threshold and the output or the makeup gain, we have effectively controlled this signal. But of course, there are way more options with a compressor and way more things that you can do with it, which leads me to the next level of understanding compressors. So by the way, this video is focused on using a compressor to achieve what's called downward compression. But believe it or not, a compressor can be any one of the following musical tools: a downward compressor, an upward compressor, a downward expander, an upward expander, a limiter, a de-esser, a gate, a distortion, and many, many, many other use cases. And I cover all of these use cases at a much higher level of detail in my Ableton online courses. I just want you to know that I have yet to get anything less than a 5-star review on my deep and thorough lesson content that now encompasses over 140 hours of video lessons on Ableton Live. When you enroll, you also get access to my private Discord server where you can get your questions answered in near real time by me and other members of our exclusive community. As a benefit of Ableton Live recognizing Seed to Stage as a great educational platform, you also get 30% off of Ableton software for both new licenses and upgrades. So if you want to take me on as your mentor and join a really rad, kind, and supportive community of amazing musicians, you can check out the link above or down in the description. Okay, let's get back to compression. Thus far, we've only been looking at compression from one perspective, and that's a signal's level or gain. But now we're going to introduce another dimension that compressors can affect, and that's the dimension of time. We already understand the how, but we haven't yet defined the when. And so along with that come 2 of the most misunderstood controls on a compressor: the attack and release. Okay, so here are the drums from earlier. I'm just going to grab a compressor and drag it onto this track. Now I want to point your attention to the attack and release here. Now maybe attack and release are familiar terms to you because you're used to hearing about the ADSR, or attack, decay, sustain, release envelope on a synthesizer. Now when you play a synthesizer, the ADSR envelope reacts to what? It reacts to a trigger, or when you put your finger down on a key. When you put your finger down, it goes through the series of ADSR to determine the envelope sound over the synthesizer, usually the volume, and then maybe another one for some modulation. Believe it or not, a compressor is exactly the same thing. It's waiting for an event. Now, can you guess what that event is? Well, the event is the signal passing the threshold. When the signal passes the threshold, the compressor responds by applying its volume envelope over the signal. And what does this envelope do? It reduces the gain. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and compress these drums. So let's use what we already know. I'm going to go ahead and pull my threshold down and then pull my output gain up to compensate. And again, I'm using extreme examples so that we can really hear what we're doing here. Now, Before I get into moving the attack and release controls around, I want to point something else out. There are actually a couple different ways that time can apply to a compressor. And the first one that I want to talk about is actually over here. You can see that you can choose between peak and RMS. You can also choose to use the compressor as an expander, but that's outside of the scope of this video. But of course, I cover all of that in my Ableton online courses. Anyway, up until this point, we've been using root mean square, or RMS. What does that actually mean? Well, let's look at the meter over here. We can see that there are two different colors here. The bright green represents RMS signal, or in other words, that's an average of what I believe to be about 300 milliseconds of time. We also see darker colors that spike up way higher. What's that? Well, that's the peak signal. Essentially, the peak signal is just saying how loud is the signal at any point in time. It's measuring a very, very short amount of time, whereas the RMS is measuring an average of time, okay? What we can actually do is tell the compressor which one of these measurements do we want you to react to. Right now, it's reacting to the RMS. It will push the signal down when the RMS signal passes the threshold. But I can switch it to peak. And the thing is that peak is doing what? It's going way higher, isn't it? Right? So let's go ahead and look and listen to the difference as I switch between peak and RMS. We can hear that with peak mode, it's reacting a lot faster. So we're actually, the attack or the transient of the drums is getting reduced. It sounds more like fwa, 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 instead of ba, 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 right? Take a listen again. So that's the first thing to understand. We're going to go ahead and leave it on peak for now, and let's go ahead and look at attack and release, okay? So if I take attack and I turn it all the way down, okay, so as fast as of an attack as I can get it, the result of this is that you're going to just hear none of the drum's initial transient or smack, and all you're going to hear is the decay of the drums and the associated room reverb, if there is any. Take a listen. Another thing that we can hear is some garbliness to the audio. It sounds a little bit distorted. And that's because peak is so fast. We're triggering that envelope super fast when using peak mode. But does that mean that using peak mode always means distortion? Of course not. And let me show you why. At this point, when we look at the gain reduction, it looks like a vertical line, doesn't it? Whenever there's a new drum transient, it looks like it's just a straight down vertical line. We can see that vertical line there. Watch what happens and listen to what happens as I increase attack. Ooh. So a couple things are happening here. First of all, that vertical line seems to start to have more of a slant to it, doesn't it? Let's keep opening it up and watch. Now we can see that our gain reduction starts to look a little bit more smooth, right? And instead of being a vertical line down, it's starting to get a little bit smoother. It's also compressing less, and we'll get to why that is in just a moment. But first we need to talk about what attack is actually doing. So the attack controls the amount of time it takes a compressor to reach its full gain reduction. At low settings, the transient or the initial smack of the drums nearly disappears, leaving only the decay portion or, again, the room reverb. However, at high settings, the initial transients of the drums are punchy, and they smack your ears in a really pleasing way. Why? Let's go ahead and compare two different waveforms with compression applied, but one will have a short attack, and one will have a longer attack. Okay, so in this first example, in this blue waveform, I'm using peak mode at 0.01 milliseconds of attack, essentially the fastest that I can get this compressor to react to the signal. And due to having such a fast attack, the compressor is pushing the signal down, and we're not getting any of the attack of the drums, any of the bam, the smack, right? Take a listen. Right? But on this one, this green waveform, I'm using 20 milliseconds of attack. And as you can see, the initial transient of the drums is coming through. And not only is it coming through, it's actually emphasized. So when comparing these two waveforms together, we can clearly see that a longer attack time makes your audio have more punch. Okay, especially if it is percussive material, opening the attack time will allow for more transient attack. Okay, that's why they call it attack into your audio. So again, attack is how long it takes for the compressor to get to its full compression, or in other words, to get to its full gain reduction, okay? Now release is the other side of it. Release is how long it takes for the compressor to recover from its full gain reduction. So in this case, we have it set at 30 milliseconds. Let's go ahead and listen to what happens when we increase the release time. On the gain reduction here, we can see that the compressor can't even recover fast enough to get back up to its original level. If we have shorter release times, though, take a listen. We can see that between each drum hit, we get a full recovery. In other words, we can get the compressor to pump a bit. At low release times, the compressor is recovering quickly, which allows for the compressor to do a thing called pumping, okay? And this is actually a musical tool that you can use. If you want to add a pumping element to an instrument, you can have low release times and slightly longer attack times, and you'll have great punch and quick recovery. But this also can make signals sound erratic and weird, okay? So longer release times make audio sound smoother. So if you want to smooth something out, sometimes using longer release times is better. Let's go ahead and open our release time a little bit. The other thing to understand about using longer release times is that you might have to turn up your output gain to compensate a little bit more, because if the signal is never recovering from its release time, then the compressor is going to sound quieter when you turn it on versus when you turn it off. So in this case, I would turn my output up a bit. Now, something else you can do is you can change the shape of the envelope. At this point, it's set to logarithmic, but you can also set it to linear. I'll go ahead and switch between these two, and let's watch the difference. We can see that with the linear mode, it looks more like a sawtooth waveform, okay? But most of the time, I like to focus on using logarithmic because it sounds a little bit more natural to me. Now, the next thing to talk about is, of course, the look-ahead time. And this is yet another extremely misunderstood feature inside of a compressor. What does look-ahead time actually do? Well, the thing to understand is that your compressor is not Nostradamus. The compressor does not know what's going to happen in the future. It can only react to the signal once it hears the signal, okay? But you can actually cheat time. And what you can do is you can allow your compressor to see what's coming before it actually happens. By default, the compressor is set to 0 milliseconds, or at least Ableton's compressor is. But something that you can do is you can force it forward in time, okay? So let's go to maybe 1 millisecond. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to tell the compressor to apply its envelope sooner, okay? And let's go ahead and use RMS mode, and let's maybe talk about one reason why we might want to do this. Well, let's say I want a really fast attack time, okay? I want to crush those transients. With the RMS mode at 0 milliseconds, we can still hear the punch of the drums. Take a listen. But let's go ahead and give our compressor a superpower to be able to see into the future. So let's go ahead and we'll take our look-ahead time and set it to 10 milliseconds. Now the compressor will hear the signal and react to the signal 10 milliseconds faster than before. So take a listen. We can only let a really small amount of that initial signal through, and this allows the compressor to get ahead of the signal a little bit. And if we switch to peak, check this out. This is when it gets really wild. The compressor will be ducking well before that initial transient and really just smearing the audio and turning these drums into something completely unnatural. Take a listen. And you might be wondering, why on earth would anybody do this? Well, something that's really cool about this is, especially if I turn the release time up, is that we can really emphasize the room. Take a listen now. Pretty weird sounding, right? But check this out. Here's another control that I want to introduce, and that's the dry-wet control. If I listen to the drums dry, take a listen. The drums sound natural because, of course, that's the original signal, right? Well, something that I can do with the dry-wet control is now start to introduce that overemphasized room and do a thing called parallel compression. I know that my wet signal sounds crazy and like super saturated with the room, right? But my dry signal sounds pretty good. If I add these two together, I'll have this really interesting enhanced version of my drums. So this is yet another way to approach compression, where you have this hyper blown out, wild, wet signal. Let's crush it even more. But we add the original signal back in. Now, of course, our attack is very quick, and that quick transient right there is getting distorted a little bit. You can hear those crackles. So we're going to open this up just a little bit. But it's still going to be way ahead because what are we using? 10 milliseconds of look-ahead time. But if you look at our attack time, it's 0.12 milliseconds, okay? We'd have to crank it all the way up to here in order to get those initial transients to come through. In fact, let's go ahead and listen to it all the way wet. So now we've covered two different dimensions of a compressor, the signal level and then the time. I like to think of the next dimension as the compression degree, and this brings us to level 4 of understanding compressors. Okay, so for this next level, let's go ahead and take a listen to this guitar track right here. We can hear that in this first section, I played each note pretty much the same level. But in the second section, I got a little sloppy, and that first note and that third note right here, or fourth note, was a little bit quiet compared to the other notes. And so, of course, what that will mean when we go into a mix context is that maybe that first and fourth note would get drowned out in the mix. So this is a great opportunity to use a compressor to not only make this specific section sound smoother, but to make the whole guitar sound smoother. And that's the idea that I'd like to try to accomplish with this compressor. So let's go ahead and do what we know already. So I'm going to reduce my threshold and turn up my output gain. So let's go ahead and listen to this one part and see if my quiet notes and loud notes are pretty much the same level. Great, so that's a lot more smooth than it was before. Here's before. Here's after. Cool, so our compressor's doing a decent job of smoothing that out. I'd like a little bit more attack though, so I'm gonna open my attack up a little bit, and maybe I'll make my release time a little bit longer. Let's take a listen again. So up until this point, we have ignored the ratio control right here. What's up with this thing? So essentially the ratio tells the compressor what degree to reduce the signal whenever the signal passes the threshold. And right now it's set at a 4-to-1 ratio. On most all compressors that you'll ever see in the wild, there are going to be ratio controls. And what this is saying is for every 4 decibels that goes into a compressor, only 1 decibel will come out. Okay, so in this case, whenever signal passes this threshold right here, depending upon how high it gets, it will reduce it at a 4-to-1 ratio. So let's set it to an 8-to-1 ratio. What would that mean? Well, that means for every 8 decibels that comes into the compressor, only 1 comes out. What does that actually translate to? More squash. Let's take a listen. Now notice as I back it off, we actually are seeing less and less gain reduction. And what else is happening? Well, the guitar actually sounds smoother, okay? This is something else to pay attention to. Higher ratios make the compressor more aggressive, okay? So the controls we're going to go over in this level, level 4 of understanding compressors, is how to determine how aggressive a compressor actually is. So I think that actually maybe around 2.5 or 2 sounds a little more natural with this guitar. It almost sounds like the compressor isn't even there, which a lot of the time is the goal. A compressor is there to control a signal. You don't always want to know that there's a compressor on the signal. In the drum example in the last level, I was hyper compressing those drums because I like the sound of a hard smacking compressed sound on drums. But in this case, I want this guitar to sound a little more natural. And so lowering the ratio actually allows this guitar to breathe a little bit more, but it's still controlled. Take a listen. Now we're still getting compression though, especially here. Let's listen to the difference. We can hear it goes dum dum ba, right? Take a listen to the compressor. Notice that is like a transparent controlling of the signal, okay? So that's what the ratio does. Now you might be wondering, well, why would I ever want a high ratio if it makes the compressor sound aggressive? Well, first of all, you might want a high ratio if you want to control vocals or drums or maybe even a whole mix. Let's go ahead and turn the compressor all the way up. Infinity to 1. What does that mean? Well, that means for no matter what amount of gain you have going into the compressor, only 1 dB will come out. So what can we do here? Well, check this out. If I switch my compressor to peak and I turn my attack all the way down, what have I created here? That's right, I've created a limiter, okay? Essentially, now, this is how a limiter is set up. More specifically, this is what's called a brick wall limiter. Essentially, a brick wall limiter has an infinite ratio, a pretty quick attack, and we're reacting to the peak signal. Okay, so check this out. We can see how controlled that signal is, but we can also hear what? We can hear that crackling, right? Well, that's because our attack is happening so quickly that it's cutting the wave off, therefore causing clipping digital harmonic distortion, right? But I can open up my attack a little bit. And I can sort of dial back that distortion a little bit. Now let's go ahead and look at something else. I'm actually going to switch over to the transfer curve view. Now what is this? Essentially the transfer curve view is a lot more simple than folks make it. There is an input signal, right? And that is the horizontal axis. It's a graph, right? The y-axis is what? That's the output, okay? So what we're showing is the effect that the compressor would have over the signal from it versus its input to its output. And we can see this crazy curve right here. Now, if I back the ratio off, what we're going to see is we're going to start to see it flip up until it goes completely diagonal. And at diagonal settings, we have a 1-to-1 ratio, or in other words, no compression, okay? As I turn ratio up, essentially you can see what'll happen to the output versus the input, okay? And now we can see this little circle right here. Well, what's up with that? What's going on with this circle? Well, this circle represents the threshold, right? So again, the threshold is what triggers the compressor to actually compress. Or in other words, when we're looking here at the transfer view or the transfer function or the transfer curve, when the signal gets higher than this fulcrum, of course, it's going to push the signal down by a ratio, okay? Now, you might be looking at these 3 lines and being like, well, what are those 3 lines representing? Well, check it out. If I turn the knee up, those 3 lines expand. If I turn the knee all the way down, those 3 lines collapse into 1. And now we can see that there's a perfect fulcrum. Let's go ahead and move our threshold up a little bit. The threshold is controlled here in the transfer curve view, okay? But we can see that that is essentially the fulcrum and that it is a perfect point upon which this transfer function will move. And so higher ratios, of course, cause that fulcrum to move. And then, of course, if I want a limiter set up, I can set it right here. And essentially what I can do with a limiter and a 0 decibel knee is that I can use this as a brick wall limiter and basically say that no signal will ever get louder than this point right here. Check it out. Let's bite into it a little bit more with our threshold. And we say, okay, negative 20 dB. Now I'm going to turn it off. Notice how signal got a little bit louder. Essentially, I'm using this compressor as a hard limiter. Now, using Ableton's compressor as a limiter is definitely not recommended. It is not designed or set up for that. But the transfer function really helps describe and show what's actually happening here. Now let's get back to the knee. When I pull the knee all the way down to 0, this is what's called a hard knee. Okay, so any signal that passes the threshold will immediately be pushed down by the ratio. But check this out. You can actually open the knee up. Now, this is where a lot of people really just lose the plot, okay? Opening the knee up, what this essentially does is says that as the signal approaches the threshold, it will start to get compressed before it even reaches it, okay? Check this out. Let's go ahead and we'll open the ratio up to a more reasonable area. We'll open the attack up a little bit, and let's listen to this compressed guitar signal. And let's go ahead and open our threshold up so that we can see this phenomenon in action. Maybe we'll bring it up here, and I'll open up the knee more. Notice how there's still gain reduction before we hit the threshold. We can see this in activity view as well. Even though there are notes that are not crossing the threshold, we can still see the gain reduction react. So what's going on here? Well, essentially, this is yet another way to make a compressor more gentle, to make it less heavy-handed, to make it less aggressive, okay? And another way to think about that is this is a great way to make a compressor sound more transparent. So let's go ahead and dig into the signal a little bit more. And let's move our ratio down a bit. Now, even here in peak mode, even though it's reacting very quickly, the compressor sounds transparent, but it's still controlling the signal a little bit, okay? So that's the idea with this level. You do not have to use a compressor as like a blunt weapon, right? A compressor can also be a gentle process that is transparent in a mix. And what this can do is this can help you control a badly recorded take in a way that doesn't sound overblown or hyper compressed, okay? I see a lot of folks who, edgelords on the internet who are like, I don't even use compression, blah, blah. And I think it's because of the Dunning-Kruger effect of not understanding that a compressor can be used in so many different ways that to ignore a compressor as a tool is just a crazy thing. Because at this point, you can use a compressor to such a hyper degree, and Ableton's compressor is so unbelievably flexible when it comes to the way that you set it up that there is just no reason not to explore using this tool. But even with all the knowledge that you have thus far, there's still yet another level to explore when it comes to understanding compressors, and that's level 5. Okay, so for this final boss of understanding compressors, let's take a look back at our dynamic synth again. And let's go ahead and use what we've learned thus far to compress it. Now, to me, using peak mode on this sounds really nice. There's a little bit of harmonic distortion that the compressor makes that's just so pleasing right here. Now, thus far, we have talked about how a compressor can interpret peak signal or RMS, but what we haven't talked about yet is that there's other ways to tell the compressor what to listen for. Okay, so the first thing that I want to look at is the sidechain filter. Believe it or not, the compressor is not hearing the same thing that you are. This is what the compressor's hearing. Essentially, the same thing that you're hearing, albeit that there is a high-pass filter set at 80 Hertz. Check out what happens as I start to sweep this up, and look at the gain reduction. Check it out. Now only the high notes are triggering the compressor, and the low notes seem to be getting by scot-free, right? Well, that's because this is the signal that the compressor is now hearing. This is what's called a sidechain filter, okay? So if I turn this off, now that doesn't mean that you're going to hear the signal high-passed. You're basically dialing in what the compressor is listening for, okay? So check this out. We could keep going with this. And what this is going to allow us to do is to, again, make the compression more transparent, because really it's those high notes that are bothering us, right? So let's dig in a little bit more. And what's so awesome about a sidechain filter is it allows us to dial in exactly what we want to have compressed. Let's go ahead and go down to the guitar. So listening to the guitar, check this out. Right now we're compressing the whole thing, but we could go to our sidechain filter and we could switch it over to a bandpass mode. And just like before, I'll click on the headphone icon right here, which will allow us to only hear the sidechain filter signal, not the actual signal. This is what the compressor hears. And what we can do is dial this in to find a range that maybe we want to compress for. Okay, so maybe I'll turn the frequency up until I can get into some of that jangly area that I don't like hearing on this guitar. And check it out. So right now, this bandpass filter is very wide, but if I turn up the peak gain, this will make it more of a point, okay? Sounds like 3K is my area that I'm really not digging, right? So now I'm forcing the compressor to pay more attention to that range, and I'll turn off the sidechain, and now let's listen. You'll notice that that high note probably had a lot more jangle in it, right? So I can duck that one down a little bit. Now, I think that my threshold might be a bit strong. Let's pull it back a bit. Right? So this is a way to tell the compressor what exactly to listen for. And let's go ahead and look at maybe even a more complex example. So I bounced my drums all the way down, okay? And let's go ahead and use this signal along with the bass. So here's a bass. And let's go ahead and play that along with the drums. I can go ahead and grab a compressor, and I can actually arrange a sidechain relationship with the kick and the bass without actually having a separated kick drum track. Check this out. You can open up this little guy right here and choose external. And you can tell the compressor to listen to something else other than the bass. In this case, the compressor is living on the bass track, but I can instead choose input source, my drums, the bounce down version of it, right? And I can choose to filter this signal down. Right now, this is what this signal sounds like. Let's just listen to it. Even though the compressor is living on the bass track, we've turned our external switch on, which now pipes in different audio for the compressor to react to. And right now it sounds like the whole kit. But what I can do is I can switch this to a low pass mode, okay? And I can say, okay, everything under, I don't know, 114 hertz will now be what the compressor reacts to or listens to. So check this out. Right? We can see those snare drum hits right there. Maybe we should pull this back a bit. Something like, yeah, 100. So now I've got all that signal right there to chew into. But check it out. You can make the resolution even more. You can turn the sidechain gain up. So if I turn this up a bit, now I have a lot more resolution to work with. So I can start to pull my threshold down. And so this arrangement, we should probably use the peak mode, okay? I'll turn my attack down pretty low, and what this is gonna do is duck the bass signal whenever the kick drum hits, right? So let's go ahead and turn off our headphones and take a listen to before and after. So before, after. And of course, we could turn the ratio up to make the degree more. Maybe turn the release time up a bit. Now let's go ahead and listen with the drums, and we'll A-B it. We can hear that with the compressor on, there's a little bit less garbly-gook and rumble down in the low end. So not only can you filter the sidechain signal, but you can actually send signals all over your set to different areas by using the external sidechain input, and you can choose different inputs here. And so the opportunities here are endless. You can even blend between the original signal and the input sidechain signal to get even a more varied kind of compression response. So yeah, there are so many different levels to understanding a compressor. Awesome. Well, I hope you're walking away from this video with a lot more compression skills that you can use inside of your own music. If you want to support my channel, the only sponsor of this stuff is me. So if you want to check out my Ableton online courses, it's chock full of all kinds of video lessons just like this. And as always, if you like this kind of thing, like, comment, subscribe. Much love, everybody. I'll see you next time.